Quandel had spent years serving his community as a police officer. Now that he was retired, he looked forward to a peaceful life in his dream home, a place he had worked tirelessly to afford. His beautiful property included a spotless backyard and a shimmering pool, the perfect setting for a tranquil retirement. But despite his efforts to enjoy that well-deserved peace, one major problem kept spoiling his quiet life: Karen. Karen was the textbook definition of entitled. She acted as though the entire neighborhood was hers to rule, and, unfortunately for Quandel, that included his backyard. She had no shame about sneaking onto his property, using his pool like it was her private resort. At first, Quandel tried to give her the benefit of the doubt. Maybe she was honestly confused about who owned the property. But after multiple episodes, it was clear that Karen believed she had the absolute right to do as she pleased. Quandale attempted to handle things the proper way. He confronted Karen directly, informing her that she was trespassing. She laughed it off. He put up "no trespassing" signs, which she ignored. At last, he called the police, assuming they'd see the situation for what it was. But when the officers arrived, they brushed aside his concerns. Some even sided with Karen, acting like it was no big deal. It didn't matter that he owned the property. It didn't matter that Karen had no permission to be there. The officers simply wouldn't take him seriously. Quandel knew exactly why. The bias was obvious. Karen was a white woman, and he was a black man. No matter how much proof he provided, the authorities refused to step in. Then the situation escalated to a breaking point when Quandel overheard something that infuriated him. While passing by Karen's yard, he caught her bragging to a friend about her final swim in his pool. But it wasn't just another trespass. She was planning to drain the entire pool afterward, ruining it completely. He had reached his limit. If the police wouldn't stop Karen's behavior, then he would, on his own terms. Yet, he wasn't about to charge in with fury. He had a more clever plan up his sleeve. Quandel had a busy day ahead, with an important business meeting he couldn't afford to miss. He wasn't about to waste more time kicking Karen off his property, but he also wouldn't let her get away with damaging his pool. He needed a plan that would teach her a lesson she'd never forget. He drew on his knowledge of chemistry. He recalled an old trick involving iodine and starch, which, when combined, could temporarily dye a person's skin a bright blue hue. It was harmless, but impossible to ignore for hours. Quandel grinned to himself as he carefully stirred the mixture into his pool. The liquid remained clear, completely undetectable to the naked eye. The moment Karen took a dip, the reaction would kick in. It wouldn't hurt her, but she definitely wouldn't be able to hide it. Satisfied with his setup, Quandel grabbed his belongings and left for his meeting. Sure enough, Karen didn't waste any time. The moment Quandel's car disappeared, she strutted into his yard as though she owned the place, dropped her robe, and dove confidently into the pool. At first, everything was normal. She floated, relishing her stolen luxury one last time. But then a faint blue tint started creeping over her arms. She rubbed at her skin, bewildered, and the color deepened by the second. Within minutes, her entire body was an unmistakable, vivid shade of bluish, smurf-like color. Panic seized Karen. She leaped out of the pool, water pouring off her as she stared at her hands in horror. No amount of scrubbing could remove the dye. It wasn't just her hands. It covered her face, legs, arms. Every inch of skin was stained an alarming blue. She looked like a walking cartoon. At first, she tried to convince herself it was a trick of the light or some weird pool reflection. But as she raised her arms, examining the staining more closely, reality crashed down on her. She splashed frantically, hoping more water would help, but it only set the dye further. Desperate and frightened, Karen bolted across the lawn back to her own house, leaving puddles behind as she tore inside and ran to the nearest mirror. What she saw nearly made her lose it. Her reflection looked nightmarish. Her entire face and body had turned an outlandish shade of blue. She shrieked, grabbing a towel and rubbing her skin vigorously, then trying soap, water, even makeup remover. Nothing worked. It wasn't just on her skin. It was in her skin. When the shock wore off, anger took its place. "This is his fault," she screamed, glaring toward Quandale's home. In Karen's mind, Quandale had committed a great injustice against her, the woman who always got what she wanted. She refused to acknowledge her own wrongdoing, or that she'd brought this fiasco on herself. No, in her version of events, Quandel was to blame. Her eyes flicked around the garage, seeking revenge. She spotted a wooden bat leaning against the wall, seized it, and gripped the handle so tightly her knuckles turned white. If Quandale thought this was funny, she was about to show him he'd messed with the wrong person. Quandale arrived home from his meeting in high spirits, pleased at how smoothly it had gone. He parked in his driveway entirely unaware of the ambush waiting for him. The moment he stepped out of the car, he noticed Karen standing there, bat in hand, her skin a glaring shade of blue, her expression contorted with rage. "You did this to me!" she roared, her voice hoarse from yelling. "You think this is some kind of joke?" He barely had time to register the odd sight, a furious, blue-stained woman brandishing a bat, before she lunged at him. She swung wildly, her form utterly lacking any control. But Karen had made a critical error. She assumed Quandale was just a retired officer. She didn't know he also held a black belt in martial arts. In one swift, practiced movement, he sidestepped her swing. The bat whiffed through the air, striking nothing. Karen stumbled forward from the momentum, and Quandale moved in quickly, striking her wrist so that the bat tumbled to the ground. Within a heartbeat, he had twisted her arm behind her back, forcing her onto the grass. She let out a piercing shriek, thrashing in a desperate attempt to free herself. Quandale hardly had to exert himself to hold her down. "You really thought this would go your way?" he muttered, shaking his head at her folly. Karen kicked and screamed, but she was stuck. Quandale knew his security cameras had captured the entire scene. This time, when he called the police, he'd have indisputable proof of her trespassing and assault. He refused to let Karen slip out of this with another sob story or a wave of entitlement. He'd watched her weaponize her tears and twist facts too many times to count. But this time, he had video evidence backing him up. Unbeknownst to Karen, Quandale had installed top-of-the-line cameras around his property after the police continually dismissed his concerns. They'd recorded her repeated intrusions into his pool, and now the footage would show her attacking him with a bat. As Karen howled and flailed, Quandale calmly reached for his phone. This time, he wasn't asking for an officer to swing by and chat. He was reporting a crime. "Yes, I have an intruder on my property. Assault with a deadly weapon. Everything's on video," he said in an even tone. "Send a unit." Still oblivious, Karen only screeched louder. "You set me up. You poisoned me. Look at me, I'm blue." Quandale barely glanced at her. "Oh, trust me, Karen. Everyone's going to see you like this." Within minutes, red and blue lights lit up the street. Officers poured out of their vehicles, expressions perplexed at the sight. A fuming, water-soaked, blue-tinted woman pinned to the ground by an older man who barely looked winded. When Quandale finally released his grip, Karen leapt up, adopting her customary melodrama. "He attacked me," she yelled, pointing at him in trembling outrage. "He did this to me. He's been targeting me for months. Arrest him." An officer lifted a brow. "Ma'am, please calm down." But Karen ramped up her performance, pressing a hand to her chest, voice shaky. "I'm the victim. He set a trap. I could have died." Quandale, arms folded, watched with a small, knowing smile. "You should check my security footage," he suggested. The officers exchanged looks, then nodded. Minutes later, they reviewed the video, right there in the yard. The truth was undeniable. Karen had been trespassing, trying to vandalize the pool, and then she'd ambushed Quandale with a bat. The officers' faces hardened as they realized the real story. Karen's was a lost cause, especially given the cameras had recorded her every move. "You've got to be kidding me," one officer muttered under his breath. Then, turning to Karen, the lead officer spoke in a flat tone. "Ma'am, you're under arrest for assault, trespassing, and property damage." Her jaw dropped. "No! Wait, he set me up. This isn't fair. I'm the victim." But it was no use. The handcuffs clicked around her wrists. For the first time, Karen understood there was no escape from consequences. She'd spent her entire life skirting responsibility, using her tears and theatrics to avoid repercussions. Today, she finally met her match. Still wet and dyed blue, Karen was led to the squad car, her furious screams echoing in the neighborhood. "This isn't over. I'll sue you." She only got halfway through her rant before the officer slammed the door, cutting her off. Quandale stood at the edge of his porch, quietly watching. He thought about all the times he'd tried to handle Karen politely. All the frustrations he'd endured, fake police reports, her condescending trespasses, her blatant disrespect. He'd tried calm conversations, signage, calling the authorities, and nothing had worked until now. He let out a measured breath. Justice had finally arrived, and Karen had only herself to blame. As the police cruiser drove away in the fading sunlight, Quandl cast a final glance at his pool. The water sat still and crystal clear, unspoiled at last. No more stolen swims, no more shrieking disputes, no more invasions. Shaking his head in disbelief at how things had turned out, he allowed himself a small chuckle. Of all the endings he'd imagined, he never guessed Karen would end up bright blue and hauling a bat around his driveway. She had lived a life of entitlement and manipulation, only to end up a glaring, cautionary example of what happens when bad behavior meets real consequences. Quandl smiled, stepped inside, and locked his door behind him. He hadn't needed petty vengeance or brute force. He'd simply given Karen exactly what she'd earned. A harsh lesson in accountability, served with irrefutable proof and a little color. Reminder to please like and subscribe, please.